Before we start this video, large thank you to Theory, Ice Cloud, Ryan, James, Luke, Dream, Phil, Sean, TJ, Teria, Shane, Anthony, Aziz, Mabido, and Gaia for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody. Okay, let's finish off our weapon buff system. So let's go to the weapon buff consumable item, and let's make this derive from a consumable class so we can utilize the attempt to use consumable. And now we're just going to finish basically painting in the logic and just call everything in the right places and set up our weapon prefab so we can actually try this out in game. So let's erase the base from attempt to consume item. Now let's see, do we have a successfully consume item? No, we don't. Well, we need to make one because you can get interrupted while you're trying to buff this weapon. And if you get interrupted, you don't want to go through with the buff. So let's go to the base class and let's actually do a small bit of refactoring on this too. So you can see this uses a bunch of scripts because this is old code. We don't need to do this. Let's copy and paste it and change this to successfully consume item. But then let's also get rid of all of these variables and let's just call the master variable, which is the player manager, through which we can access all of these sub variables. Because this is just needlessly long, and this is back from a long time ago when we first made consumables, and I guess we just haven't revisited this code since, so this is why it's still like this. But that is the nature of the beast. You're always changing things when you add on new logic. So let's make this work for the new method we have by putting player dot in front of all the other variables. Oops, I did the wrong one, so I'm just going to copy this and paste it up here because we're not going to put anything in successfully consume item right now. And let's save that. All right, I'm going to periodically sip tea while I talk over this, so apologies if that's annoying to anybody. Let's go over to the bomb consumable item and do the same thing, give it the same treatment. Delete everything except for the player manager and make it just basically put player, for example, weapon slot manager is player dot player weapon slot manager. And down here, player dot player animator manager and then player dot player effects manager and so on and so forth. So just do that with basically every single consumable item that you have. I believe we have 4 right now, I want to say. Maybe 3? No, I think it's 4. But while we do this, it's just the same thing for the next 3 or 4 scripts. 3 more scripts. So I'm just going to talk about what we're going to do today. We're basically going to take all the logic we made last time, and we're going to hook it up and make it so when we use a consumable, our weapon buffs. Now, I'm taking this logic mostly from my project Nephilim. So basically it's set up and oriented in a way that this work on multiplayer. So it's very split into different pieces. For example, we're going to use the weapon buff effects themselves as a separate object from the weapon buff consumable item. And this is because if you ever want to use these things in multiplayer, you can assign them basically identifiers using integers, the same way we do stuff with our saving system. And I set it up so if you join a game where somebody has their weapon buffed, you'll be able to see that buff. I know this is over a lot of people's heads and it doesn't make sense right now. It doesn't need to. Just know that I have it set up this way for a reason. You can simplify it if you want. I still find it's pretty easy to understand and digest. It's just there are I'm going to say a few modular components instead of one greater component just to do it overall. So it's kind of split into a couple different pieces. And again, if you don't like this, feel free to modify it to your needs. I just wrote it this way because this is the way I wrote it in Nephilim. I think it will all make sense to most people when you get it, when it's all laid out in front of you and you can kind of look at it. But again, as always, I encourage you to tweak things to your liking because I know people like to write code in different ways. I certainly have my own way of writing. I'm sure everybody else does too. All right, so that is the final edit now. So let's go to the weapon buff consumable item. Let's call our successfully consume item. Let's erase the logic. We don't want to derive anything. And now let's begin by going back to our consumable item again. And we need to make a new function as well. One more. This one's going to be public virtual void, so we can override it. Not void, sorry, bool, because it needs to return a bool. And we're going to say, can I use this item? And this is going to be very useful for any consumable that you want to check before attempting to consume. If you can't, well, obviously you won't even run that code. But also in the future, if you want to make it so your UI kind of grays out, you can check using this function. And if you can't use it, you can kind of just fade out your UI, which is also what I do in Nephilim. But it's going to serve a purpose here too, because we're going to check if we can buff a weapon, because not all weapons can be buffed, as you know. So we're going to start by saying if player dot player and not player animator manager, sorry, player inventory manager dot, and then we're going to do current consumable dot is it current amount? What do we call that variable for what we have remaining? I need to check that real quick. Okay, yeah, so it is current item amount is less than or equal to 0, then return false. So basically, if we have 0 or less of the item we're trying to use, obviously we can't use it because we have nothing to use, so return false. And now we have to check for our melee weapon to see if it can be buffed at all, but we have a problem. We have a weapon item script, which is used for all of our weapon items right now. What we want is to be able to buff melee weapons only, because you don't want to be able to light your bow on fire. I mean, maybe you do, but you would think you would light your arrows on fire, not your bow. So what I'm going to do is go over now to the equipment folder where we have all of our scripts for like head equipment, weapon items, etc., etc. I'm going to make a new script. I'm going to call it melee weapon item. And it's going to derive from the item script, or weapon item script rather. So let's make sure we put our namespace in so we can see that. And the only thing that's going to be different in the script so far is that we have a bool for can be buffed. So we're going to make a bool here, public bool, so we can access it, can be buffed. Now, this means that for every melee weapon you now have to make a new one using this melee weapon item script. But as I said before, that is the nature of the beast. Every time we add new systems, things have to change. That is just inevitable. So let's make a melee weapon item variable, call it melee weapon, is equal to player.player inventory manager.write weapon as a melee weapon item. So basically, we're going to cast it. And if the weapon is not null, meaning you are holding a melee weapon, and the melee weapon can be buffed, then we will proceed. Now, I'm just going to say return true. Now I'm going to do this in the class of the early Souls games, so I'm going to make it so you can only buff your right weapon, but with some modifications you could easily make this buff your left weapon as well. I haven't done a Nephilim, but again, where those systems are tangled in with multiplayer, I'm just going to keep this as simple as I can. If you guys want to edit it to buff a left weapon, I'm sure a lot of you can figure it out, and if you're having problems, let me know and I can revisit this and make it so you can buff a left weapon with this code too. So I'm going to make a comment up here: if I can't use this item, return, and make a comment. If I cannot use this item, return without doing anything. So we're checking this. We need to make sure we're holding a melee weapon and it's buffable and we have items left. Now down here on attempt to consume item, I'm just going to copy and paste the logic from the base class. And if we have an item amount of over 0, I guess you don't need to check for that because we already did. So you can erase that if you want. We're going to play the consume animation, and if not, we're going to play shrug. So it's actually not going to run the shrug code there, so you can put that in the can I use this item if you want, but I'm going to keep it there. I'll adjust that later. We have a housekeeping video coming up real soon. So I'm going to say on successfully consume item, player dot character sound effects manager dot, and we want to play a sound effect, but apparently we don't have a function to do that. So let's go to the character sound effect manager script. And what we're going to want to do is create a function to play a sound effect that we pass and choose in a script. And I'm going to take a sip of my tea. Okay, so I'm just going to minimize these, and right below play random weapon whoosh, I'm going to make a public virtual void for play sound effect. I'm going to require it to pass an audio clip. I'm just going to call it sound effect. And then I'm going to say audio source.play one shot, and we're going to pass our sound effect. If you want to, you can add a variable here too for the volume and then pass that as a float, but I'm going to keep it as that. Nice and simple. All right, play sound effect and buff trigger sound. So when we successfully consume this item, we are playing the buff sound effect. And next we want to actually buff the weapon. So I'm going to say base.successfully consume item. And why am I doing this? Well, I'm going to go back to the base class. And on this, I'm going to say current item count equals current item count minus 1. So basically, it's going to run the base logic, which subtracts 1 from our total, and then runs the buff logic here, which starts off by playing a sound effect. And then right below that, I'm going to say weapon buff effect. Weapon buff equals instantiate a copy of our weapon buff effect. And then I'm going to start by saying weapon buff dot is right weapon is equal to true, because I'm setting this up for buffing your main hand weapon. And then I'm going to say player dot player effects manager. Then we're going to say dot right weapon effects, right weapon buff effects, which we don't have made yet, is equal to weapon buff. And then I'm going to say player dot player effects manager dot process weapon buffs. So we don't have this made yet either, but this is very straightforward. We're going to do that right now. So you can see here we're going from the consumable, and we're handing it over to the player effects manager. The player effects manager is where we're going to handle everything that affects our character stats and I will say any overtime effects. And the weapon buffs are going to be an effect over time lasting for the length or the duration of the buff. So let's make a header. I'm going to call this right weapon buff in case you want to make one for left as well. And right here, I'm going to say public weapon buff effect, right weapon buff. All right, so I'll call it right weapon buff effect just to keep the name very clear. And then down here, let's make our logic for processing any buffs we have on our weapon or weapons for left and right or right. So as I said before, I'm only going to do the right hand weapon. So I'm going to start by just saying if the right weapon buff effect is not null, then we know we can proceed. And then we're going to say right weapon buff effects dot process effect pass our character. All right, pretty straightforward. Save that now. Come back over here. I'm still getting an error. Yeah, because I have to put an S here, I think. I call that process weapon buffs. Yes, that's it. All right, save it. Now we're moving along nicely. Let's go over to the weapon buff effect script. We need to make an override for the process effect, otherwise nothing will happen. Now, we're going to utilize every single variable in the script right now. So we're going to start by saying if the buff has not started, we want to start it obviously. And we're going to say time remaining on the buff is equal to the, whoop, got my scripts mixed up. That's what I wrote in Nephilim. Time remaining on the buff is equal to buff length or length of buff. So I think the default for us now is 60 seconds or something, so it's going to set it to 60. And then right below that, we want to say buff has started is equal to true. And then we're going to say weapon manager equals character dot, this is our weapon slot manager, character weapon slot manager. We're going to say dot right hand damage collider dot get component in parent weapon manager, because we're going to set up our prefab so the weapon manager is the parent of our damage collider. All right. Next, we're going to say weapon manager dot audio source is dot loop is equal to true, and then we're going to say weapon manager dot audio source dot clip is equal to the ambient buff sound. And then we're going to say weapon manager.audio source volume is equal to ambient sound volume. This just makes it so the ambient noise of your buff, like looping fire effects, we're just going to play. Let's set up a float next for the base weapon damage. And the base weapon damage is equal to your weapon manager.damage collider.physical damage plus all your other damage types. So in my case, it's just fire. And the reason why we're doing this is because we have our buff set up to make a percentage of the base damage equate to your buff damage. So for example, if your buff makes your weapon 15% stronger, it's going to take 15% of your base damage and add it on to its respective damage type. So we're going to make another float down here called physical buff damage is equal to 0, and then a float for fire buff damage equal to 0. And again, just put all your damage types here. I just have 2 for the sake of demonstration. And we're going to say if buff poise damage, so if your buff does indeed buff your poise damage as well, we're going to say buff poise damage is equal to weapon manager dot damage collider dot poise break. I think it's what we called our poise damage. Yes, it's definitely poise break. Times, and then we're going to say buff base poise damage percent modifier multiplier divided by 100. And I just realized I didn't make a float for my buff or for my poise buff damage, so I'm going to do that right now. So right below the fire buff damage, I'm going to say float poise buff damage is equal to 0, and I meant to put this right here at the beginning, not buff poise damage, because that's a bool. All right, there we go. So if we're choosing to buff our poise damage, we're also going to increase that by the percentage modifier of the buff. So I think the default is 15%. Next, let's make a switch statement for our buff class. Not sure why that is not autofilling. It should be a lowercase b. It should be our variable for buff class. I did it again. Okay, I'm just going to manually insert it. There we go. All right, so in the case of a physical buff, what you want to do is say physical buff damage is equal to base weapon damage, and I'm going to rename that because I've spelled it wrong. And then we're going to do times, open up some brackets, buff, and we're going to go buff base damage percent multiplier divided by 100. And then do the same thing for fire, but say fire buff damage is equal to base weapon damage brackets buff base damage percent modifier divided by 100. What does this mean? Well, basically, whatever our percentage modifier is on, as I said before, so if it's on 10%, we're going to take 10% of our weapon's total damage and apply it to our buff damage. So if it's a fire buff, it goes to fire. If it's a physical buff, it goes to physical. If it's a lightning buff, it goes to your lightning damage, etc., etc. Next, we're going to say weapon manager dot buff weapon, and we're going to pass our buff class, our physical buff damage, and our fire buff damage. And for your case, it might be a bunch more. It might have lightning, darkness, magic, whatever. And then pass our poise buff damage as well. All right. Moving along, just below this if statement now and outside of it, we're going to say if buff has started, we're going to say time remaining on buff equals time remaining on buff minus 1. And then if the time remaining on buff is less than or equal to 0, then we want to call weapon manager dot debuff weapon. And this will end the buff. Then we're going to say if is right-handed buff, you're going to go to our character effects manager and say that the right-handed buff effects, or right-handed buff, whatever we called it, is equal to null. So character effects manager dot right weapon buff effect, that's it, is equal to null. Cool, and that is it for this script, so let's move on. All right, so we have an error. Let's click this. Our input manager. This is because we need to erase everything here and just pass the player and save. All right, we're good to go. Now let's go into our data, our items, our weapons. Now let's scroll down here. I'm going to find this. I've just been using the sword this whole time, so I'll stick with that. You can see here it's a weapon item, and we actually can't use this anymore. So we have to go to our melee weapon. We have to go and basically copy this create asset menu and make it so we can, and let's delete the old one because we don't ever want to make a regular weapon anymore. In the future, it'll be caster weapons, melee weapons, or range weapons. And then let's go here and say items / melee weapon item. There we go. Save. And now let's delete or drag a sword to its own folder. I've made this a bit more organized. I'm not going to delete this yet because we're gonna look at the old values and we're going to copy them exactly. I'm going to make the sword identical to what it was. So I'm going to right click, create items, weapon items. I'm going to create a new weapon item, melee weapon item. I'm going to call it sword. And then I'm just going to not do this on video, but I'm going to go over every variable individually and make them identical to the other sword. So you drag in your prefab, for example. You set up your weapon type, you set up all your damage types, and I'll be right back. I'm just going to do that real quick. All right, so now that's done, I am going to delete the old sword eventually. And I'm going to go, make sure you go to your weapon item database and drag in the new sword. Because remember, if your weapons aren't on the database, they aren't going to work when you save and load. You do the same thing with your consumables too if you set it up that way. I'm just saying this one time, I won't do it anymore. So now let's go over to our player inventory manager, and I'm going to drag in the straight sword. And I'm also going to make a create asset menu for this weapon buff consumable item. And I'm going to call this weapon buff. And we want to actually drag in this on our current consumable after we set it up. I'm not going to set up the item database for this because I assume you know how to do it by now. It's the exact same thing as the items. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to press on. And I'm going to take a sip of tea. All right, cool. So I'm just going to call this fire buff item. Now, we need to fill in these variables. Item name, fire buff, item ID. I won't fill this out because I'm not going to do that. Max item amount, I'll say 10. Current, I'll say 10. No model because it's a consumable. What is the animation I want to use? I'm going to call it buff underscore weapon underscore 01. Is interacting, yes, and we need to fill in the weapon buff effect and the sound effects. First, I'm going to drag in my animation. Got one here that Rob made me from Nephilim. Very nice. You can find free animations on Mixmo, or you can find a lot of buff animations on the Unity Asset Store. Yeah. So let's jump back over to the weapon buff effect. Going to make a create asset menu for that. Character effects, weapon buff effect. Going to save that. Now let's create the weapon buff effect character effect. Let's put that in data, character effects, create, new character effect, weapon buff effect. There we go. Going to call this fire buff effect. Going to change the buff class to fire, the length of the buff to 60, time remaining 0 because that's defaultly assigned anyway. Buff ambient sound. Okay, let's get some sound effects in here. And yeah, the multiplier is 15% extra damage. So going to drag in 2 sound effects, one for the looping sound of our buff and one for the buff sound itself. So on the buff ambient sound, I'm gonna have my fire looping. You guys can't hear this right now because I'm not recording the audio of my computer this time around. But you'll know it works on your end because you'll hear your own. And then the buff trigger sound, I just got this buff weapon with fire trigger sound. I'm also taking from Nephilim. Gonna make the weapon buff effect the fire weapon buff effect. And now, when I put this consumable in here, it should work if we have everything set up correctly. First though, let's go to our weapon prefab, and we have to make, we have to get rid of this old damage collider. We have to set up the weapon manager, and we have to set up the new particle effects. So I'm going to put the an empty game object under the model. I'm going to call this weapon manager. I'm going to make the weapon manager script on this. I'm going to parent everything inside of this under this script. So this is like the master of all these little effects and the damage collider. I'm going to put the weapon manager script here, and I'm going to drag in my normal particle effects for the default trail. I'm going to duplicate this and quickly make a fire trail just for demonstrations. I'm not going to spend any amount of time on this at all because, again, this is a polish element, and I'm just showing you the functionality, as is the nature of the tutorial series of this series anyway. So I'm just going to, I want to make it fade out a little bit right there at the end. So I'll edit the alpha channel, and I'll put a second alpha channel right here and also make this one a little bit more faded. All right, so yeah, that's fine. I'm going to rename it from normal weapon trail to fire weapon trail, and I will put that in the weapon manager variable under the fire weapon trail. Again, if you have lightning, darkness, magic, however many damage types you have to make a trail for each of these if you want. I think it looks cool. And let's go to the fire buff effects and the physical buff effects. So I just dragged in this asset from the Sinti model. I made my own in Nephilim. I'll show you those at the end of the video, but this is just some fire particle effects I want to basically turn on when the weapon is fire buffs to let you know it's buffed. And I'm just going to duplicate that and make one for physical, but not enable it. So you want to make sure both your physical and fire buff effects area variables are filled. If you don't have anything for your physical, just create an empty game object. It's okay. Now, put our damage collider down here. So make a new game object for damage collider. Paste the old damage collider on top of it. And then put the capsule collider on top of it as well. This is because the damage collider, this is important. It needs to be a child of the weapon manager because of how we have these scripts set up. And make sure your layer is on damage collider, and then remove the old damage collider and the capsule collider. And make sure you have a melee damage collider and not a damage collider. I missed that here, but I'm going to go back and correct that immediately. I'm going to disable the fire buff effects, keep the fire trail on and normal trail because they're not going to play unless you ask them to play. And here we go, the melee weapon damage collider. I'm going to take a sip of my tea again. All right, so next let's go to the character animation manager, because we need to know when to successfully activate this buff. If we get attacked during the animation, it's not going to activate. So let's create an animation event here, or a function that will be called from an animation event rather. And I'm just going to call it, you could call it enable consumable or enable. That's kind of, let's just call it successfully consume item. That's the best name for it, I think, because it matches the name of our successfully consume item functionality in the consumable item script. So I'm going to say successfully use current consumable. That's even more clear. And we're going to say if character.character inventory manager .current consumable does not equal null, then we want to say character.character inventory manager .current consumable .successfully consume item. Now, a note, you want to make sure you can't switch consumables when you're interacting. Otherwise, you could use this item, switch to another consumable item, then activate that one with the old animation. Just a bug that you could possibly run into. So make sure while you're using consumable items, you can't switch to a different one. I'm actually going to put this on the player animator manager, not the character animator manager, because I forgot we've set up our consumables so they can only be used for the player right now. We're going to revisit that and make it so the AI can use them in the future too. But for now, put it on the player animator manager. We can move that back later on. All right, so let's save that. Okay, so now over in the project, let's go to the art, the animations, and I'm going to show you a different way to make an animation event. If your animation file is just an FBX, like this, I'm going to set it up so it has the proper animation settings. You can actually go down here to events, and this is way easier. This is what we're doing for Nephilim now as well. And you can drag this, and it shows you exactly where it is, the exact frame, and then you can actually just click this little plus icon, new event, put in the function name, and click apply, and there you go. You can do it the old way too. It's all the same. I'm going to make sure I have all the variables set up in my weapon, and then I'm going to jump back over to the weapon buff effect script. I'm going to put a debug.log here to show the time remaining on the buff. And this is where we're going to run into our first limitation, or our only limitation right now, because we haven't expanded our character effect system fully yet, which will happen in the next video. So if I try to buff this weapon, this is what's going to happen. Boom, it lights on fire, the sound effect plays, but the time remaining on the buff is the same. Why is that? Well, because we haven't finished our character effect system. We haven't expanded it fully to support tick effects yet. We're going to do that in the next video. But the weapon is buffed. Check it out. The fire comes on. The sound effect plays. The ambient volume is playing. And if we go into the scene and click on the straight sword and go to its damage collider, you will see that 15% of the damage, I believe the base damage is 27, is added to our fire damage. Yes, that is 4.05. Cool. All right, so that is 100% working as intended. But we have one small problem. If we attack, you can see that the trail is still white. We don't want that. We want to play the fire trail. This is very easy to fix. Let's go over to our character effects manager. You can see here where we're calling our right weapon effects from the character weapon slot manager. We actually want to basically come here and change this from a weapon effects variable to a weapon manager variable. And again, this is on the character weapon slot manager. Character.characterEffectsManager.WriteWeaponEffects is equal to, change that from weapon effects to weapon manager. And then back on the character effects manager, we want to go over here and say weapon manager. Change these variable types to weapon managers. And then we want to rename them after that's done to right weapon manager and left weapon manager. And now, instead of just playing the one default effect we have, we just simply call upon the manager, which will identify the correct one to play for us, depending on what class the weapon is buffed with right now, if buffed at all. So just say play weapon trail effects, and that is it. And then you are good to go, and that should work as intended. All right, let's save that. And now if I go into play, and I clear out my console here, and I equip my weapon, I'm going to buff it again. And there the sound effects is playing, the sword comes on, lights on fire. And then we go, and there it is. The trail is definitely a nice fiery color, and the weapon is in bulleted in flame. So there is a cool thing you can do. I'm going to show you Nephilim now. I'm just going to drag in my other project. So in Nephilim, you can see I can buff the weapon, and I can actually buff my left hand weapon too if I equip it, and then I can put my right hand weapon on my back. But it's not what I'm showing you. You'll notice that the blade of my weapons Nephilim change color. Well, this is actually a trick my modeler friend helped me set up. What I'm doing is in the sword here, I have another blade. I just chopped off, or he just chopped off the blade in Blender and made it, and pasted it again, but made it the tiniest bit bigger so it overlaps the regular blade. And then when I buff my weapon, I enable it and I apply a material to it, and that's it. I fade in the material over time. So not only do I have my electrical effects, but I have the blade turning a golden color as well. You can see that really adds to the buff. If you guys are confused about how to do that, I can go over it in another video, a polished video, but I think it adds a lot, because then it actually turns the blade color to match the particles coming out of the blade. So what you want to do again one last time is to just take the blade of your weapon, cut it out, and duplicate it in Blender or Maya, whatever you're using, and then make it the tiniest bit bigger than the regular blade, just enough so it's not overlapping and kind of meshing together the materials. And then when you buff your weapon, you enable this secondary blade, and you apply the material of your buff to it. And then when the buff ends, you disable it. It's that simple. Alright guys, so if you did make it this far, I know this was a very long video. If you drop a like and leave a comment on the video, I really would appreciate that. It does genuinely help the series get around so much. Thank you to all of you who always do that. I sincerely appreciate you. And thank you to my Patrons who support the channel. It is because of you guys I get to keep doing this, and I love doing this. So guys, in the next video, we're going to go back and revisit our character effect system and add the logic for effects over time, like poison and your weapon buffs, etc., etc. So I will see you in the next one. If you guys want me to revisit this eventually and show you how to buff left-hand weapons, or also how to do that cool effect with the blade, please comment below. I can do that as well. All right, guys. See you in the next one.